for a little bit.
All right. Hello, everyone. We're not going to start quite just yet. We're just going to give it a few more minutes for people to show up. So just hang tight, and we'll start in a few minutes. All right. And also for a preface for like this show as well, and I'll say it again once we actually get started in the show as well. Feel free to leave comments and any questions that you might have for any parts of the show when you need to. I'll answer them as soon as we can, or we might save them till also at the very end as well. So we'll get to that when we hit 7 o'clock, and then we'll get this party rolling. Under that, I hope everyone who's watching so far has had a wonderful day and a wonderful evening. Alrighty. Alrighty. For those of you who just came in, we're going to start the presentation in the next 2 or 3 or so minutes. Just give some more time for people to show up. Until then, hold tight. Yep. Start the show in a little bit. But for those of you watching and who are here now, welcome, and thank you for coming to my senior virtual art show, Expressions of Depression. My name is Evan Wick, and I'm a senior from Nebraska, from Blair, Nebraska. I am majoring in art, graphic design, minoring in graphic design, and minoring in film and media production. And yeah. And I'd like to thank all of you people for showing up and coming and watching the show. All right, we're going to give it one more minute and then we'll get into this. All right. Nothing like starting a few minutes, at least a minute early. So let's get into this. Once again, thank you, everyone. Welcome. And thank you all for coming to my senior art show, Expressions of Depression. My name is Evan Wick. I'm a senior from Blair, Nebraska. I am majoring in art and minoring in graphic design and film and media production. And the pieces that we'll be going over in tonight's show are a collection of oil paintings that I've been creating over these last 2 semesters. And they're all based around the expressions and also just it's based around the collections of how I want to visually express my interpretations of depression and my story of what I've gone through. So, without further ado, let's get into this. And also, for those who might be coming in a little bit later as well, this stream will be going up on YouTube later, and this slideshow presentation will also be pressed up late, presented later for you guys to go through on your own. And it's a completely virtually interactive slideshow art gallery, and everything is clickable. So let's get right into it. So as I stated before, everything is clickable from the paintings to other things. We'll have miscellaneous rooms that we'll go through. But going through first, let's go through my artist statement for what this show is truly about. So, and like this will give like this a certain run through. I'll leave this out for you guys to read it. And right now, this current body of work is a reflection of my past and current experiences that I face through my depression on a weekly basis. I struggle with a lot of anxiety and fear of not living up to family and self-expectations. I deal with a lot of self-loathing and my ability and with believing in my own skills, knowledge, and aren't even good enough to be an actual artist. And for those of you who do know me in person, you guys may know me as some person who always likes to put myself down over, like, I do tend to put myself down on occasion just to somewhat seem humble, but also at the same time, you know, I do honestly go through some of those emotions of just not feel like I'm living up to an expectation of some sort. Anyways, going forward, the way how I start producing a lot of these paintings is through photographs, photographing myself or an environment and using that as a reference for planning out my composition. And I use it by resketching, taking the photograph, having a printout of it next to me while I sketch it back out on the canvas, just to make sure I have everything fitting to scale. And then also throughout that thing, I also make some minor alterations to the canvas itself to give like portray the specific sort of message or sort of liberty of like something I'm trying to express within a canvas. So it gives me that sort of freedom of will to actually work with design and build a strong composition to portray a certain story. And the reason I chose oil paints was it's one of the art mediums I felt most comfortable going throughout my Doan experience. Like I've always felt most comfortable, like when I first came to Doan, I was intended on going through sketching and drawing and sort of stuff like that. But after I started using oil paints, just being able to create like a lot of like movement and texture and a lot of like different color differences and mixing, I just felt like it was like a much better fit for me in terms of like, you know, creating like emotional impacts and portraying a message. And just like, I don't know, it looked way better in my eyes to be able to work. And like I thought it was much easier to work with it. And a common theme you'll see throughout a lot of these paintings tonight, I use a lot of black and white, and I wanted to represent the lack of like depth and emotion I feel ultimately. And like when it comes to showing like the darker side of my subconscious of what I'm thinking about on the side of me that most people probably don't ever see very much because they don't show it very much. And the uses of color express like the better hope of a future of something I'm seeking to reach sometime. So amidst like a lot of the black and gray backgrounds, I'll have a lot of a few splashes of color and just a few highlights, just get that little oomph to the style. And a lot of art and a few references I took reference to when I was starting to look at like develop my style through this. I took a lot of reference through like Vincent van Gogh and Leslie Oldacre. Mostly specifically with Vincent van Gogh, it's more so like his kind of brushstroke style and it's like how visible his brushstrokes are, and seeing like the sort of like movement and sort of thing that you get through, and like just the way how he portrays a sort of energetic feel just by looking at the canvas. While also, I took a lot of inspiration from Leslie Oldacre, just from the way how she builds the composition, and also just the overall composition of like how she builds like her paintings and sort of stuff like that. Anyways, let's move on to our very first painting. So the first painting we're going through is Heavy Thoughts and Empty Canvases. And the overall feeling is like, this is my beginning process. This is a representation of like where any artist comes to when it comes to making art, preparing for a show, or just like getting things down on canvas. You have that moment of sitting down, of having reflection, and thinking about like, how do I portray this message? How do I build the thing, and just ultimately where do I start? And ultimately, like for me personally, this is like a lot of things of like this is like a much deeper message in terms for me of like, how do I start in portraying this sort of message that I want to present out to people out there who don't understand how the different sort of forms and like shapes of how depression affects people. Because like everyone has seen like depression. There's a lot of like very cliche sort of types of depression that people see in art and sort of stuff like that. And like, how do I portray a common message of uh showing people of like, how people can portray depression on an individual level to what a particular person can say or see about a particular subject without it turning into a cliche. And ultimately, this is like one of my favorite inspiration of like starting paintings that I had for getting myself started on this process. And as you can see, right off the bat, it's a lot of black and whites, and the light flooding in as like giving a sort of thing of inspiration and guidance, while also like just the darker shadows of the outside, and just like having me holding the blank canvas and looking longfully of like, where do I start? And yeah, and also just for a reference for people who haven't heard before or just coming in, feel free to make any comments or ask any questions you like throughout the presentation. Oh, thank you. And I can read them off as soon as I can. Also, we might come back to them at the very end of the presentation, and I'll answer the questions as well. Anyways, moving on, we'll go on to our second painting called Reflection. Now, this is actually one of my very first conceptual pieces that I really like, and mainly because like it's very unique in the fact of like, it's like a sort of concept that has been done before, but I wanted to go about it in a way that flips it on its head, where normally it's like I look at it as like a reverse mirror in a sort of sense, where like normally when you see this concept, people draw or paint themselves looking into the mirror, and they're looking at versions of themselves of how they see themselves. However, I wanted to turn it on its head and show this on the reverse scale of showing how I feel in myself versus how other people might see me on the outside. And that's ultimately what that is, because the version that you see of me on the left side of the painting is me with full of just confusion, anguish, and just like overall just anxiety, manifesting in a sort of like black cloud of confusion. And it's not a very weary drifting cloud, might I add. It's like a very explosive and a very active moving cloud. And in the backgrounds of this whole entire scene as well, it takes place in a darker forest, which is another common theme that you'll see throughout this sort of painting. That it's the forest is representative of feeling lost and alone in a darker area where you don't where you don't feel comfortable and it's harder to find your way out. And this is actually one of my favorite pieces I got to work with. Was that, let's see here. Sorry about that, minor difficulties. Alrighty. Okay, but I think this is one of my ultimately one of my favorite pieces I got to work with was just being able to have a chance to work with the comparison between darks and lights, because I focused a lot with like having the fading of the light, of like creating that sort of like faded texture with like the lights above the mirror and sort of stuff like that, with the common like sort of fade, and in like in comparison where we have like the sort of like pitch black of like the cloud with specks of white just showing the sort of like depth and breaking apart of that sort of character in that sort of sense, where it's just a complete reversal of how normally you would view the sort of sensation of this sort of thing. And yeah, I'll open it up for a few minutes, for a few seconds, if anyone would like to ask any questions or make any comments before we go a little bit forward. And alrighty, moving forward, we're going to be moving into our third painting called Fading. All right, so this painting is actually a more specific feeling I wanted to express in terms of a sort of period that I went through roughly around my sort of sophomore year, where I was going through a really hard time of dealing with a lot of anxiety that I had towards just other miscellaneous things that were going through me at the time. I was going through a difficult breakup at the time, and I kind of felt just kind of lost, and I felt like I was definitely breaking down. The significance of like the plate in this series is the sort of like there was a moment of time where like I stopped, where I felt like I couldn't eat for the longest time. And it's not that I just physically couldn't. It's just like, I just came across many times where like I just didn't feel very hungry. I pushed a lot of meals off, and ultimately just like the sort of ache and sort of feeling that I felt, whereas I just started feeling a little bit more weaker and a little bit more broken apart. And that's I tried my best to make that a lot more evident in the visibility of ribs and the sort of like breaking down, and like the sort of ribs and like the sort of wrinkle lines you can see on the side of my torso there. And and that's also like the main thing of like the whole entire subject for this painting was the feeling where like I felt like I was sort of fading away, in a sense of feeling just kind of alone, and I just felt like I was in a time where I felt parts of me were just sort of flaking off, and I was becoming a lot less of something that I was. And ultimately, I think one of my favorite parts I got to do with this particular painting in general was actually being able to go in and create the spotted details, including the sort of like the method in which I did the actual flaking, that sort of like spotted texture that you see. It was actually a technique that I used where I dipped my paintbrush in the paint, and then I wetted it, and I just held the paintbrush up to the canvas and put my thumb over the top of it, and I just flicked all the paint onto the canvas, and it just created like this wonderful flaking effect. And you'll actually see this effect a few other times throughout some of the other paintings that I've done. And uh, and yeah, I think it's a really great piece, and it's just ultimately a very strong piece that I hold in the collection that I've made so far. Anyways, moving on into the next room, we have our next collection of 4 paintings, and we'll be starting here on the left wall. And this painting is called Dark Thoughts. And this is actually a much more one of the few more slightly more colorful paintings that I have in this collection. Mainly just because, this is something I wanted to focus on where I had a specific theme of it's more than just a black and white sort of subject of thinking. It's uh, this it's sort of like I felt like I was surrounded in a sort of cloud of sort of like a darkness of a sort of like poisonous environment, and it's uh, where it just felt very unsafe and very disorienting. And the little scribbles that you see in the little black clouds that you see coming out of the back of the skull are actually a conglomeration of just random and dark thoughts of uh, just confusion and hopelessness and uh, sort of weariness. And these aren't any sort of spots of anything specific, and it's never really, if anything, just that anything that's always that direct. But the one true thing about the whole entire I want to portray in this, it's the fact that a lot of these dark thoughts that you get is that they're subconscious. The dark skull on the back of my head is a representation of that subconscious of thoughts I can't control. It's ideas of things that are out of my control, or things I don't always wish to feel that way, but it just sort of appears anyways, and it's just always back there at the back of my mind, spewing out just really dark comments and sort of just messages that I tell to myself on a somewhat almost daily or weekly basis that I go through. And and it's always a struggle to go, and it's like there's plenty of people who always go through these kind of struggles of dealing with bad thoughts and dealing with that voice inside your head that's telling you that, oh, you're not good enough, and oh, you'll never reach this sort of goal, or oh, these people don't like you. It's a hard battle to go through, and luckily in these days I've actually been going through it a lot better than I have been, but it is honestly a real concept uh, that I've gone through before in previous times in the past, and it's a very difficult thing to go through to conquer. um. Anyways, I'll leave it open for a few seconds if anyone would like to make any questions or comments on the current show so far or in this particular piece. And alrighty, moving on. Okay, so this next piece is called Run. And this one is a representation of being in a state where I feel in like this sort of emotional state of feeling like you're surrounded by a lot of your problems. And I grew up a lot of my life as like a runner. And one of the best ways how I felt like I've always dealt with some of my down thoughts and some of my emotional things is just a little bit through running in some cases. And uh, and that's exactly the sort of message I want to portray in this sort of thing here. The dark hands that you see reaching out from the dark side of my canvas is representation is a representation of the sort of dark things I feel that haunt me on a daily basis, and something that I always feel like I need to try and get away from. And the reference I actually use myself in this particular photo is actually pictures of me during one of my cross country races, and I wanted to catch that sort of aspect of it being a very scary thing to try and run away from, because like it's not always a true thing that people can always run away from their problems and feel like you're trapped or being held back by a lot of things, especially things from the past as well too. Um, and I think that's like also one of the better creative processes of like I wanted to make it like, it's not just a stagnant black. It's like it's a moving black. It's an elements of just like there's also just elements of pain that go into holding this sort of that sort of anguish and sort of heartache of like dealing with these sort of problems, just like in the same way like sort of pains that you feel when you go through running and sort of stuff like that. Actually, in the going on the technique side of things of like how I put this sort of painting together, I actually drew myself and worked with a little bit with some of the proportions in that sort of sense, and painted myself in lightly. And then when I was painting in the hands and doing the rest of the background, I actually flipped this painting sideways, so I had a chance to let the paint just run and create that sort of movement and that sort of just like streamline effect of like of just speed and just like that anguish of just trying to run and get away out of and escape from these sort of the sort of problems that you try to deal with on a regular basis. And yeah, that's just another really good piece. And moving forward, okay. So this next piece I call distraction and comfort. And the basis of how I put this one together is finding the sort of light in the sort of like darkness of amidst the troubles that you go through on when you're having one of your panic attacks or one of your episodes. And one of those things were for me was like having those moments when I was like back home, when I was in bed feeling comfortable and I didn't have to think about a lot of the things I had to go through, was a great comfort and a lot of things that I had going for me throughout the later part, throughout the earlier parts of my college years. And just going through a lot of the sort of things that I've sort of felt. And I think, yeah, and like again, another thing representative of that sort of like finding light in dark places. You can see myself. I'm sort of like sitting in the comfort of my bed of this in the middle of the dark forest, and you can see the sort of luminescent glow of some of the grasses and the sort of light that's sort of peering in behind the trees in the back. And again, it's also illustrating towards another subject that I'll be hammered down on upon in some of the other paintings coming forward after this. But amidst like the sort of darkness that you sort of feel, there is always a sort of light that's always back there. Sometimes, like even when you don't feel it or see it, it's always back there. But again, but being in these sort of like even in like even in when you're in those sort of cases, like when you're in the thick of it and you're in these dark locations, you just have to do what you can to hold yourself together and uh, stay comfortable, and just try your best not to think so much about the things that get to you. Alrighty, moving forward. Okay, so this one is called Irrational Fears, and this one is uh, it touches on a subject that um, a lot of things about depression that sometimes get overlooked or get misunderstood, and it's about the idea of, like, sensing dangers and fears of things that might not be real, because you hear it all the time of, like, when you go in some of those depressional things. um when people tell you, like, when fear isn't out there to get you, when subconsciously, like, sometimes it's this things where, like, you tell yourself, that there's nothing out there, or that there's no, it doesn't bother me still, or, like, no, it doesn't, it's not that great big of a deal, but subconsciously we always sort of feel that sort of, like, itch of something still being there no matter what. Like, it's still just a gut feeling you feel deep down, of a sort of darkness that you feel, and you just can't shake it. And that's what I wanted to illustrate in the sort of scene here, throughout, of just, like, what would seemingly look like just a regular nature walk outside, but is just a subconscious message of, like, despite uh being being out in nature, of something that's what people normally see as, like, just being a very peaceful and calming place, it's still a very dark and disorienting place, and it's also just can build up a lot of irrational fears of things that might not actually be there, but still feel just as real to the person who's feeling it, and especially for me, uh, going through some of the things I've gone through uh, back in the past. And as you can see, as well as, like, the obvious hand you see leaning down from the tree above, reaching out to grab me. Um, I also put in myself in the lower part of this picture, of the sort of, like, black cloud still clouding through my vision, of, like, uh it's and like that's also another representative thing of, like, from something from seen earlier in the show to even up till now. um it's something that goes off and on, like, it's not always just sort of like a very long spell of feeling dark and sort of something, and then it just gets better. When it comes to depression and feelings, sort of things like that, um it can come back multiple times in a very different intervals, and it can get be have very different intensities each time. But regularly, as I've been going through these days, it's actually been I've been dealing with these episodes, and sort of like um, depression scales a lot easier, and dealing with them a lot more comfortably. But they still happen, and they're still very real. Um, anyways, so that's irrational fears, and we'll be moving into the last leg of the show. Okay. So this painting is called Warm Flames. And this is actually one of my favorite pieces I actually got to work with throughout the semester. And through some of my friends and colleagues that I've showed this to, I've gained a lot of high praise for. And the big message that that was hammered down upon a little bit earlier in the distraction comforts was the ability to find sort of warmth and sort of comfort uh, in sort of the dark places that you can find yourself in. Because I've gone through plenty of like really dark times, uh, even just like dark weekends, dark nights, where I just see myself just sitting alone and feeling sound in those times. But then I find that sort of distraction, or I have a friend that reaches out to me and asks me how I'm doing, and we just have a little short conversation of how things are going. And I kind of describe that as like that sort of like that warm feeling that you get from equally, because it's kind of like a campfire, or it's like a fireplace. And you can see that's just really representative, and like also like amidst like the sort of black dark background of like the black and white and sort of like the dreariness of the scene, there's still that low glow uh of a yellow and an orange hum of that sort of warmth that you feel of just like gazing into the fire, and just like having that time to be able to sit back and sort of contemplate and have that sort of temporary relief from the sort of concern and sort of feelings that you get. And I think one of the uh, and I think one of my favorite things about this one is like this is the one I actually focused a lot of my design aspects with Vincent van Gogh, and this particular one mainly was just like the being able to how to do like the speckled spots of the rough textures of the fireplace, where it's not fully defined, but it gives the impression, but giving impression of like, you know, the sort of lucid, sort of more uh, broken up image of inferring of like creating that sort of like raw texture. And um and like also just like the comparison of like creating the sort of like uh being able to create the dynamics of like the sort of light to dark sort of ratio of like creating the white spaces on surface, and uh giving that sort of comparison, it just gives it that definitely great big like pop of color, and just ability to break things down and just ultimately just break down that sort of warm feeling that you get from the sort of scenery of within even within like the sort of like a dark space. You can still find that sort of light. Alrighty, so moving on to our next piece. Okay, so this one is called The Other Side, and contrary to what other people might say about what the other side means in this sort of context, it's a different sort of context where I'm talking about the concept of finding the sort of the way out of that sort of dark place, of like leaving that sort of depression state, of reaching that ease of mind, of feeling that sort of peace and tranquility, of just like feeling like, you know, how people would say it, like okay again, and just like things would be going back to normal. And the drastic contrast between like the black and white of the left, of like the sort of world that I've been sort of living in, was like in stench is in like a very large contrast to the outside world that's just full of color and full of light and sort of like sort of things of that nature. And it's it's still something that's still not quite hit home. And like as you can see, like even as far like with the light actually peering into uh my darker side of the zone, it's still sort of a black and white sort of thing. And it's actually the reason why I still have it where I'm still in that sort of black and white zone, and I have that sort of like um what you call it, uh apprehensive to move beyond that sort of stage, to know, am I ready to leave this sort of stage and go out into that larger space and feel comfortable in that larger space. Because just because I leave that zone and go out into that more colorful world, will I still like regain color when I go out into that, or will I still remain the same black and white that I am? And that's a big thing that's been another thing for me to come and tackle with, like, um when it comes to like getting out there and like talking about my problems and like moving forward and these sort of things like that, it's very difficult. And like, cause you never know how people are going to react to it when you tell them about it. And it's a very disorienting and it's a very uncomfortable thing to go through. And that's pretty much like the whole entire basis of like why I have it stated out with like that such large separation, including with just like the light peering down on me through that sort of aspect. And also like another thing too, um, the reason I have it too, where I have it set where you might notice like there's also like still like a flood of like gray clouds and like stormy clouds on the outset of on the outside of that painting. Um, it's sort of representative of like that sort of like it still may be all bright and colorful on the outside, but it still looms with its own storms and its own sort of problems that they're all willing to tackle with. And uh, something as it's always as true. People will always have like their own. Life will always have its own sort of troubles and storms to go through, and we all have our own sort of struggles. And it's like, and that's and like viewing out that from my perspective and looking out on that. That's just another thing I need to give my own sort of perspective on what to prepare myself going forward when I'm ready to move out into that real world space of being open and being around others and being comfortable in that outer space as compared to being in my comfort zone where it sits right now in the darker space of like where I hold all of my thoughts like really dear and close. All right. Moving forward. All right. So this is actually a very interesting piece, and it's actually probably one of my more abstract pieces. And a lot of the inspiration came from one of my fraternity mates from my sophomore year when I was going through probably one of like the darkest and probably the deepest like depression episodes I was ever having at the time. And the best way he described it to me was like, the journey through like the depression and this sort of like sad emotion and sad sort of like, feelings that you go through is that it's a journey and it's a process of getting to the place from where you are now to a place where you want to be. And from what and from what the analogy that my fraternity mate told me is to be on top of that mountain. And 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 just as it is in real life, and like even like in a metaphorical sense, uh climbing that mountain of getting to that place where you want to be is never easy, and it's always a long process. And even in some cases, you actually even need to find yourself where you need to find even have a journey to even get to those mountains in the first place. And you can I represented it by me viewing out the window onto the larger black night sky sort of like landscape and seeing like the beacon of the sort of like bright elegant almost angelic mountain in the background of that sort of like beacon of light of like hope of something I strive for and want to make it to, and that sort of like high point or like ideal place I want to be. But there's also like these long branching trails of how to get there, and sometimes the right trail is not always clear, because as you can see, like going through like over different valleys and hills. Different paths branch off and leads to different sort of like pitfalls, forks in the roads, and sometimes it leads completely of out of the right view of the mountain and sort of stuff like that. And and it's one of those things where I feel like, it deals a lot about the sort of journey and building yourself to get to that sort of mountain where you can get to that process of really building yourself up to where you want to be and reaching that sort of like uh that sort of like change that you want to see in yourself. And a lot of that comes through just through like a lot of learning and a lot of self discovery. And for me personally, um from the time that I was going through in sophomore year up until now, I've had a lot of life changing sort of like experiences that help me cope, and a lot more things that I've learned about myself going forward. Of like being able to go back and reflect about my sort of views and uh, being able to take a step back and take a bigger look of things of like the bigger picture of you know viewing myself of where I am along the journey and where I place myself in the world. And for me personally, it's like another thing of just sort of like on some days where like that I tackle with, I feel like I've been learning a lot more about myself to um, accept how things are and to accept the sort of like compliments and like and being able to tell myself like that I am doing good relatively well, and I do have like really good days, and that I am in a sense growing, and I am pushing myself on this journey, and things have been getting better. And I have a lot of like bright friends. I have a lot more people I can turn to. I also have like those episodes of like I have those times where like I feel great, and I feel connected with other people around me, and you know, it's all part of the journey. And then I also have like those other times where like I talked about before, where like I do have those sad nights that pop up, and I feel like I regress a little bit, and I kind of fall into a little bit of a pit. But it's all part of the journey about moving forward and building myself up and going forward on a sort of concept. And it's one of those things that it's not an easy thing for always people to view, because like a big misconception of like when it comes to depression is like is that you say like, oh, you get over it and you move on and things get better, and like things are sort of fine. I mean, like it's not always a sort of like a snap and like things are back to normal and things are all fine and dandy. It's just that sort of process of building things out. And yeah, so that's probably one of the biggest and probably one of the more important pieces that I've probably worked on in this sort of project, and was another one of the things I just really wanted to hit home about, of like the big overarching concept of like what I feel like a lot of people would like want people to understand about this particular painting. Alrighty, and moving on to our last painting here. um, this one is called Clear Thoughts and Filled Canvases. And ultimately, the way how I feel about this painting is pretty much like, sometimes the places where you end up, sometimes you end in the very spot where you began. And I think this is ultimately a big representation of that. So this one is actually an alteration of the original painting that you saw at the beginning of this live stream. But this time I went back and gave the alterations of painting in the sort of journey and the sort of like thought process that I went through, and put the actual paintings that you saw in this actual live stream, uh, and they're all plastered onto these paintings, immortalized for everyone to see. And like these are existing, like these are now expressed thoughts, and uh, and it's just like this is it's a point of like reflection of being able to look back and think about the sort of like main topics and sort of things that you touched on when you're going through the sort of process of creating such a show like this. And this was like a big show for me to actually like sit back and ultimately just really reflect on my time as like a senior, my time at Doane, and a time at college, and just like the way how I view like my sort of thinking and just how other people think of me. And honestly, it's been like a huge journey, and like I've had a lot of support going through this of uh being able to build myself up, and uh being able to share this sort of presentation of creating these sort of representations of what these sort of expressions are, of like these sort of things of like what depression can look like, because like there's many different forms of what depression can look like, but this is specifically a representation of what my depression felt like and what this journey ultimately meant to me. And I think, and one of the big ultimate things I wanted to do, like when looking back on this too, was like, I wanted to take a look at actually one of like the painting that I'm actually holding in this particular one is actually the second one that we looked at. And chronologically, it's actually the first painting that I actually worked on. Like it was actually the very first painting I worked on when I was beginning making this show. And I think it's just a very good representation of just like, being able to look back at where you started and contemplate about what you've gone through to get you to where you are now. And uh, and although things on the outside that doesn't seem to feel like that's changed, uh, on the inside, and just like the sort of mindset of things that you go through, people will not always see the change that you go through when you go through like these heavy episodes of depression or stuff like that. But like it's the constant building of going forward and uh, working on yourself. It's not a thing. It's not a crap that people notice, but at first, but the more that you work on yourself and the more that you build yourself up and the more that you uh, advance and have your time to contemplate and look back and go through this whole entire process and journey of like self reflection and uh, correction, and uh, just being able to find that sort of comfort in yourself moving forward, and finding that sort of peace of mind. It's a very important part of the process of moving forward. Um, and people always deal with it in different sort of ways. And I think just going through it throughout this show and being able to express these sort of feelings with everyone here, and uh, it's just been a huge process for me to be able to go through and share these deep thoughted paintings that I created. And I'm very thankful. And like, despite how hard things have been, like even for like making the show, I'm really thankful for like the process I went through in terms of making this, because it actually gave me a lot of reflection and being able to look back and uh, just sort of like reflect and find a way of like expressing my emotions in a way that I feel like that makes sense, that other people uh, can take peace of mind from as well. And alrighty, so this is the last painting that I have in my show. I can open things up to comments, questions, and if there's any other paintings that you would like me to go back and talk about some more. What made me choose the pose for fading? Okay, so the reason why I chose this pose for fading was it was ultimately just about like, that sort of like it was like that sort of lack of energy of like, and also it was also like during the time when I was like having this sort of panics attacks and also like this lack of eating. I was embarrassed to tell people about this. I felt ashamed of looking weak and going through like the sort of like heartache because like it was like the sort of expectation of like be a guy, you got this, like it's just a thing that'll blow over. You're a man, you gotta act tough, you gotta go out and through it. And ultimately when I was going through like the how serious and how uh the sort of like darkness and how sad I was feeling, I was embarrassed to tell people about it. And ultimately, I kind of wanted to represent it by just like sort of like hiding my face a little bit, and just keeping myself hidden from the sort of like problem from other people from seeing it. And that's ultimately why I kind of chose that sort of posture of just being leaned over. And also, I mean, also another thing too, or another reason why I'm shirtless in this picture is because like I was I just felt kind of in a sort of sense just sort of like vulnerable and I guess naked in a sense, but I wasn't fully naked when I did this one, but like I just felt vulnerable and kind of weak. And I guess that was one of the main things I wanted to portray in this particular one. Alrighty. Yes, thank you. Yeah. Um, yeah, it's no problem. And like for me, honestly, uh, in full honesty, for me, it didn't feel amazing, like as difficult as you would think to be able to open up and completely talk about it. The main trouble when it comes for me when it comes to talking about these sort of things is feeling being able to feel comfortable with myself after telling someone about these things, because like getting into that sort of subconscious sort of thought process of how do these people view me now that they know my sort of secret of the sort of like depression, of like the sort of like feelings and emotions that I deal with. And yeah, and thank you for your kind words on my expression and sort of stuff like that. Okay. Yep. Thank you. Going through if there's any other questions or any other comments or thoughts on the presentation. And also other like other full disclosure, I'm doing very well these past few days. I've actually been feeling very fine. I've been speaking with counselors. I've been talking with friends and family, and I'm feeling very well. And I'm very thankful for the sort of support that I've had, and very blessed for with the support that I've had. And yeah. So, anyways, going forward for like the senior show and like even for like afterwards for this sort of thing, after the graduation, I'm still planning on continuing with expressing and like I'm still going to continue with painting in creating art and selling art, and hopefully maybe on the off chance I might be able to get some of these some paintings into galleries and such. I'm also planning on taking another year out at UNO with being able to work forward with working with filming and video and filming and media editing, so I can work on video editing. Okay, and from a previous question from Cameron, what was the hardest part with working with paintings? With oil paints. I think probably one of the more difficult things is just like, when you're trying to create a particular gradient, uh you have to work a little bit fast, a little bit. And it's mainly just in the sort of aspect through, like, if you're trying to get something done within a particular time frame, you don't want to leave the paint the painting sitting out for too long. Mainly because, like, you can't let it sit out for like 2 or 3 days, because otherwise it starts to dry up a little bit, and then like the paint gets a little bit harder to move. So it's like getting stuff done in that sort of process. And also, like, another difficult thing was just like getting the right sort of like color scheme, because there were many difficult times when I was working with black where I felt like it didn't feel like it was like a dark enough black. It just felt like a really, really dark gray. And there was multiple times where I actually had to come back to some of those pieces where I had to go over it again with a darker black, just to like get it to dry out and just like get it that darker tone, and getting that sort of like shading correct. So yeah. Thank you, Wyatt. Uh, yes, this was definitely a very challenging art piece to go through. And yes, I can say I'm very proud of a lot of some of the dedication and sort of work that I went through in making some of these. But yes. Also, like, for a note for another thing too, this presentation, like this slideshow, will be available after this live stream is over, so you guys can go back and go through this yourselves and get a closer look at these as well. And also, this video stream should be available as well too, so you can go back and watch the video as well. Do we have any other questions or comments before we wrap up? All righty. Well, once again, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for coming out this evening, and thank you for attending my senior virtual art show. Thank you. Good night, and have a great evening.